You're listening to Opera Box Score.
Let's get ready to rumble!
Wherever you are, however you're listening, it's America's talk radio show about opera. It's Opera Box Score. I'm George Cedarquist, joined by Oliver Camacho, Matt Cummings, and Weston Williams. All right, this week we go inside the huddle with author Garth Greenwell, whose acclaimed debut novel is set to be produced as an opera, with music by friend of the show, David T. Little, starring friend of the show, Karim Suleiman. And since we're talking about books this week, if you're not the type of person who can sit down and read a good book, maybe you'd rather experience the opera version. We've got a summer reading, listening list. Plus, in the 2 Minute Drill, with Zarzuela performances selling out in Madrid and Juan Diego Flórez recording a Zarzuela album, is it time for Zarzuela Cuadro de Puntación?
Probablemente.
Make sure you subscribe to our podcast on Spotify. Click follow on Apple Podcasts. Hit the plus sign. Send us a voice memo or email us your hot takes, mailbag@operaboxscore.com, or even just record your thoughts using the You Got Something to Say tab on the website, operaboxscore.com. However you contribute, you're going to get the OBS beer coaster, lapel pin, and foam finger. Just for sharing your own hot take, Oliver Camacho.
I will be off the show next week because I'm going to Santa Fe Opera Festival.
Lovely.
And actually, I'm very excited to get away, but I'm also a little bit dismayed that I will be missing live Olympics coverage. I'll have to watch it, on delay in my hotel room.
Very pedestrian.
Yeah, and I think everybody will be, I'll get spoiled so much.
You will have to stay off of Twitter.
Yeah.
Which will be, I assume by Friday, equal parts Olympics tweets and coconut tweets.
That's Matt Cummings, by the way.
What's coconuts?
If you don't know what coconuts is, you got it.
Then you don't exist in the context of all in which you live and which came before you.
Matt and I are on the same page here. I love it.
I don't know what coconuts is. Am I too old for this? Is it one of those Snapchat
We're talking
things,
about our next president and how the youths of the internet have rallied behind her.
Oh, okay.
And you three are all super excited for the Olympics.
They're coming.
I'm nervous because, if I was in charge, I'd be down there in my, coveralls, scrubbing the Seine to make sure it is swimmable. Because we're getting down to the wire here, and it's still looking a little dirty, folks. We'll see what happens.
I don't know that I would trust the Seine. No offense.
Yeah, just don't swallow, people.
Breathe out all the way.
I will watch the opening ceremonies on Friday. I love the opening ceremonies. They're kind of the biggest spectacle in public art, I think, that exists on the planet. But
Look at you talking positively about the Olympics. There you go.
Yeah. After that, I'm just hoping for college.
Yet another bizarre take, George.
Let's talk some opera.
Chalk Talk on Opera Box Score.
In just a few minutes, you're going to hear our conversation with novelist Garth Greenwell, whose novel, What Belongs to Us, will be turned into a chamber opera, and we'll talk about it with Garth. But it just got us to thinking before we hear this conversation, I feel like lately there's been a lot of operas based on novels, and I'll just start, rattling off my little list of ones that I've seen. Fellow Travelers, and what's it called? Moby Dick, which is not so new of an opera.
Or a novel.
Yeah.
New York Times bestseller, Moby Dick.
But notably, Bel Canto, which had its world premiere right here in Chicago with Danielle Denise singing the Renee Fleming role.
No, it's not Renee Fleming. It's another person. How dare you think that?
So I just would like to quickly talk about what you guys have heard, what sticks in your mind is oh yeah, that was successful. That's probably gonna stay in the canon, maybe, or it's been done more than once. It's been done at least twice, so maybe it has a chance. I think Moby Dick, Jake Heggie probably has the best chance of staying in the repertoire.
Yeah.
A lot of people have done Grapes of Wrath too, the Ricky Ian Gordon adaptation of that John Steinbeck classic.
Wasn't it the longest opera ever?
It's extremely long, and it's been revised a couple times. And it's been pretty substantially cut, I believe, down to a more manageable opera length because it's very sprawling as a novel and requires like huge set pieces of a truck as they go across the country from Oklahoma to California. Jeez. So it's definitely shrunk as the years go on to try to get more and more people to do it. The music's very tuneful. I don't know that it's the best adaptation of a novel that's out there. But
well, there goes Ricky and Gordon ever being on our show.
He has to be the best adaptation of any novel to go on to our show.
We have very high standards here at Opera Box Score, obviously. Yeah. I think it's really kind of an interesting question because I really associate a lot of like novel adaptations in the opera world with like the sort of Americana-y composers, you know, sort of your Carlisle Floyds, like Cold Sassy Tree, things like that.
I think you mean to see your Carlisle's Floyd.
Your Carlisle's Floyd. I have a soft spot for an opera that was written in like the 40s, but didn't actually get a full stage premiere until 2010, I believe, which was the Bernard Herrmann opera, his only opera. He took a break from writing, you know, Psycho, Citizen Kane, and wrote himself a little opera based on Wuthering Heights, which is so idiomatic for the 50s, but doesn't quite count for this. And it apparently isn't, I don't think it's ever going to be in the repertoire anyway.
We're not doing a Hall of Fame on Wuthering Heights?
Maybe next time. I'm just going to talk at length about this opera that like 3 people have heard and that I don't necessarily think is a great opera, but I kind of love. That's a whole different conversation. There's, you know, I think it's also interesting too. A lot of, you know, operas that we consider like, you know, kind of the definitive media, you know, is opera are actually based on novels. Lady Macbeth of the Tenth District was based on a book, you know, so was, Albert Herring was based on a French novella.
Well, those are solidly in the canon. I'm more talking about
that's what I'm saying though. Like, I think there is like, a certain, there's a lot of precedent for like ending up in the canon, you know, even slightly more recent stuff. You got the Paul Reuter's Handmaid's Tale, which I believe is not super recent, but like, you know, within the past.
It's within the last 20 years.
It's in the last 20 years.
It's, there's also the other Wuthering Heights. There's Fantastic Mr. Fox, which I believe we talked about when it won a Grammy a couple years ago.
This is like kind of his thing. Like many of his operas are based on big old novels. He's got an American Tragedy. He's got Thérèse Raquin, and Fantastic Mr. Fox, like you mentioned also.
Dolores Claiborne you can add to
Dolores
that
Claiborne. I knew there was one more.
Philip Glass also has been doing a lot of novel adaptations in his sort of later career here, including The Trial by Kafka and The Perfect American, which is based on the German novel Der König von Amerika. Oh, yeah. And those have been like really well received, partially because, you know, it's Philip Glass. I think that his style is really interesting applied to novels because that sort of minimalist pulse is not necessarily the most dramatic way to bring things forward. But, you know what is a good dramatic theatrical convention is animatronic Abraham Lincoln. And let me tell you, I used to work for Chicago Opera Theater right after they did A Perfect American, and they just left the giant marionette of Abraham Lincoln in the office, and he gave me multiple heart attacks when I was locking up in the office. So excellent. That was
the inspiration for Cola Scola, maybe.
What I love about this, the number of titles which are children's books, which have become operas. So Edward Tulane, which is a absolutely gorgeous children's book.
The Snowy Day recently.
Snowy Day, Coraline, the Neil Gaiman book.
Right, yeah.
Secret Garden.
The Little Prince also had a big opera, that Houston Grand Opera, like maybe 20 years ago. And I agree with you. I think it's another interesting counterpoint to look at is like on Broadway, it's all like movies. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And like very popular movies. And versus opera is like a little bit more cerebral, a little bit more, you know, arts driven versus just commerce. Like, not that there haven't been any movie operas either. Like we had Marnie a couple years ago.
Olga Neuwirth's Lost Highway.
With all of your analytical minds, if we take away the children's books, do we see a pattern here as to what seems to be fodder for composers? What seems to be attractive types of books that would make good operas?
The driving force that you see is stories told primarily through characters, right? Because the challenge in adapting a book for the stage is you have all these multiple locations. Cummings already mentioned the whole challenge with Grapes of Wrath, right? And when I think of books which can change location in the turn of a page, obviously the theater and musical theater and opera are not built that way. So what the truly successful stories need to do is they need to be driven not by location, which is hard to replicate, but by character, which can be influenced and expressed through music.
One that's probably been among the most successful in the last decade was when Minnesota Opera did Paul Morevich's The Shining, which really like went back to the book version of The Shining more so than the Kubrick movie, which also takes out the need to like have those kinds of big iconic visual set pieces and focuses much more on like the struggles of the characters.
And it appeases Stephen King, so everyone wins.
Well, surely we'll talk about more operas that are based on novels, but since you're listening, why don't you send us a message by going to our website and using the You Got Something to Say tab, and send us a message about what book you think deserves the operatic treatment, and maybe even suggest what composer you'd like to go along with that book.
Huddle up. Let's go inside the huddle.
So we now turn to our conversation with Garth Greenwell. If you don't know his book, it means you're probably heterosexual. It's called What Belongs to You, and I think just about every gay man who reads books will have read it. It's very sexy. It's very dangerous. It's set in Sofia, Bulgaria. It's about being gay for pay and paying some straight guy to, what gay men do. And it's great. I love this book. And when I found out that it was being turned into an opera, I was thrilled. When I found out that Karim Suleiman was going to be singing in it, I was like, oh my God. And then when I found out that David T. Little was composing music, like, oh my God. And then when I found out that Mark Morris was contributing dance to this show, I was like, okay, this is like the gayest thing ever put together. So we're going to talk to Garth Greenwell about a very, very gay upcoming opera, which will premiere at the Moden Center for the Arts in September. Moden Center for the Arts, I believe, is in Richmond, Virginia. Okay, here's our conversation. Garth Greenwell, welcome to Opera Box Score. I can't believe that I'm able to talk to you. I've been a fan of your writing, and when I found out that this project was happening, I was like, holy F. And I asked the publicist for this project, can I please talk to you? We already talked to Kareem, we already talked to David for other reasons, and I love them. But this episode of Opera Box Score is for the gays.
Well, thank you so much. That's so kind, and I'm so happy to be here.
Why don't we actually start there? Because opera has always been gay, but I feel like just in the past, couple of decades, we're able for it to be explicitly gay. And with, a beautiful artist like Kareem and this novel that you wrote, What Belongs to You, and Mark Morris, it's like, we just need a gay composer. I mean, David T. Little is like, I know he's an ally, but that's the only piece that's missing.
It's so funny. It's true that it is. I mean, we'll talk about this. I mean, not just a kind of all gay almost team, but also most of us go way, way back and have been friends for decades. And David, who was brought in by Alan Pearson, who had been, Alan and I met when I was 18, and he's sort of been my best friend ever since. And he put the book in David's hands. And the sort of astonishing thing about the whole project for me is how deeply and richly and sort of empathically David entered into the book. I think always when you approach an adaptation of your work, you sort of have all of your, sort of hackles up. I mean, I certainly, even though I knew David's music and admired his music, I mean, I just expected to hear something that felt foreign to what I had made, in a way that would be sort of uncomfortable or disturbing to me. And when I heard at the first sort of workshop run through of the first two sections of the opera, I was like moved beyond words by how he created a kind of sound world that just absolutely was the book. And then Kareem, again, who's someone, I mean, we were in studio together back when we were kids, and his voice has just become the voice of the book for me.
Well, we're already talking about the collaboration, so why don't we just dig in? Because, Davy Tillittle, like, I know 3 of his works very well, and none of them sound like each other. And I'm reading in the press release, some inspirational composers for this particular opera of his, and he invokes Britten and Monteverdi, and that's like speaking my language. And I know that, that type of music is the type of music that Kareem does. I mean, Kareem does everything well, but talk about, 17th century music and talk about, Britain. And it's like, yeah, that's what I want to hear Kareem singing, Then we have Mark Morris, who will choreograph this thing. And I'm a huge Mark Morris fan. I feel like gay men of my age is like, yeah, that's the choreographer that we realized that we love dance. And Alan Pearson, I guess Alan is with Alarm Will Sound. Is that his is he the artistic director of Alarm Will Sound?
That's right. He is the artistic director of Alarm Will Sound, which Alarm Will Sound grew out of an ensemble that Alan founded when he was a graduate student at the Eastman School called OSEA, on the board of which I sat for a while I was an undergraduate at Eastman. So it really does go way, way back, like to the 1990s, this collaboration. And, thinking of sort of David's kind of musical allusions and the sort of DNA of the music for the piece, a lot of those composers like Britten, Purcell, Schubert, who are kind of woven into the piece in these really extraordinary ways. So I first got to know Alan Pearson because he was my pianist at the Eastman School of Music. Sort of, we performed together for the years that I was studying at Eastman as a singer, and that was the music we performed. And so it's a way that David has sort of, entered into the DNA of kind of the collaboration, this decades-long artistic friendship between Alan and me, that which also, as you say, plays right into the repertoire that Kareem has made his own. And so that's a way in which, talking about this project, I like to talk about it thinking about sort of art as friendship. And there's a way that these sort of decades-long friendships are woven into this musical material and really woven into the musical ideas, the stuff out of which the musical ideas come. And then Mark Morris, as you say, iconic. He was the sort of, when he signed on, after sort of the music had been written, and he came to that first sort of workshop musical run through before signing on to the piece. And so it was clearly this moment where sort of the project was going to sort of become bigger than, this sort of world of very intimate friendship. But also, my first engagement with Mark Morris, when I was doing an MFA in poetry in my early 20s, so this would have been like 2001, 2002 in St. Louis, the Mark Morris Dance Company came through, and a friend who was much more involved in sort of the dance world got me a ticket, and we went, and I saw, very late in Mark Morris's performance career, I saw him dance a solo piece, one of the Satie toy piano pieces. And that really did just sort of burn itself into my aesthetic retinas as kind of an ideal of what art could be. So in that way, too, it feels like something from way back in my artistic life is being woven into this project.
I remember seeing L'Allegro at BAM and just being overwhelmed with how beautiful it was. Like I can't, I can't watch this. It's too much.
DVDs talking about gay. I mean, the DVD of Dido and Aeneas. Like, I mean,
Yes.
that is something that I have loved for years and years and years and years. So it's really exciting to have him on board.
Well, let's rewind it back a little bit since you invoked the idea that you did train as a singer. You wrote this article for The Guardian, which we'll link to on the show notes for today, that really blew me away. And I came to this article after having read What Belongs to You and had no idea that this was part of your DNA as an artist. Can you just give us the elevator speech of what, this Guardian article is about and how you were sort of rescued by opera?
Yeah, I mean, that's really the word for it. So, I am from Kentucky. I grew up in the sort of pre-internet American South as a queer kid. I did not come, I was first generation raised off the farm. My family were tobacco farmers. And it was not a household in which I was exposed to things like opera. And, I love to tell the story, and I especially love to tell the story. I spent 7 years as a high school teacher, and I would tell my high school students this. I became an artist because I failed freshman English. And I failed freshman English because I was a terrible student. I didn't care about school, but also because when I was 14, my father found out I was gay and kicked me out of the house. And it was right at the end of first semester of ninth grade. And I failed my class. And because of that, I needed extra credits. And very literally, because I thought it would be the easiest option, I auditioned for the school choir at this public school in Louisville, Kentucky. And it just happened that that choir was directed by a man named David Brown, who died just a couple of years ago. And he was a brilliant singer and an extraordinarily generous educator. And he heard something in my voice. I had signed up because I had sung in church choir. I had never studied music. I had never thought of myself as talented in any way. But he heard something in my voice and he started giving me voice lessons after school for free, which again, I would not realize for 20 years until I was a high school teacher, what that meant, that, after those grueling days of teaching high school to then donate more of your time. But he knew what a lost kid I was, and he knew that I sort of desperately needed something. And he gave me my first opera cassettes and videotapes. And he also gave me tickets to the Kentucky Opera, which back in the day was a really actually exciting company. And the first opera I saw was Così fan tutte, which now I adore, but then did not have much of an impact. But the second opera was Benjamin Britten's Turn of the Screw. And the experience of watching that opera, I just felt like, I don't know, like the top of my head was blown off. Like it just, in ways that I wouldn't understand for many, many years, really radically reoriented my life. And there was a way that, growing up in the American South with certain models of sort of masculinity and how one should be, it was just utterly clear that in the world to which I was born, there was no place for me. And opera to me sounded like a world in which there might be a place, a world in which there could be a place. It sounded like the opposite of the place where I was born. And it gave me just a direction in which to point my life. And, so I would go on. This same teacher brought me an application after my sophomore year of high school, brought me an application to the Interlochen Arts Academy. I ended up spending junior and senior year there and then going to the Eastman School of Music. And then after 2.5 years, I took a poetry class and I ended up quitting singing and beginning this sort of long journey as a literary person and becoming a writer. And what I have come to realize is that those years, 7 years or whatever it was that I spent very intensely studying voice and studying opera, that was really a training in being a writer. And I think sort of everything I do in my novels owes itself to that operatic training, and just this sense of sort of beauty and of drama and of emotion and how to construct a narrative. All of that came from opera.
It sort of feels like American gay Billy Elliot.
That's so funny.
If that resonates with you.
Without those beautiful themes, yeah.
But since you invoked the idea of your home and not feeling that you belong there, and maybe even opera not flourishing there, what is your opinion of some of the more recent opera productions of canonical repertoire that are set in flyover country America? Like, I don't know if you saw that Lucia that they did with all the video projections and really clearly invoking some, Texas or Alabama landscape. And then there's that Carmen that they just did at the Met, which I'll go on record as saying is one of the ugliest things I've ever seen. Thank goodness for the singing and the people they cast in it, but I had to close my eyes for especially the last act. Have you seen those productions?
I have not. I was in New York for the past 2 years, but I missed the Carmen production, in part kind of because I heard a lot of that. And I do think many of the Met's new productions have been kind of dismaying for various reasons. I don't have thoughts in general about that. Like, I like the idea of reimagining sort of traditional rep and putting it in unconventional places. I also really like the idea of finding a place in opera for stories that come from those places, and one of the things that excites me about the way that David treated my novel, is that, like, the second act, there are scenes that are set on a farm in Kentucky, and it is exciting. And David, in this really kind of stunning way that actually makes me think of, like, the opening of Britten's Midsummer Night's Dream, or of Britten's actually Rape of Lucretia, that has those wonderful sort of night sounds. He brings sort of the sound of that world into the musical texture of the piece. My feelings about the place where I'm from, Kentucky, and also the place where I live now, Iowa City, also in flyover America, have become really complicated and rich. And, something that has been very moving for me in recent years has been coming to see, these places that I felt, and I think I was right to feel, that I had to flee, and that they were places where really I could not live. Coming to rediscover or discover for myself some of the queer history of those places and the richness of those places has been something really wonderful. So, I think opera belongs everywhere, and certainly in flyover states.
Well, for those who haven't read What Belongs to You, in essence, it's in like 3 parts. The first and third parts in Sofia, Bulgaria, and the middle part in flyover country. I'm sorry. Is that okay if I said it that way? Yeah. Is that how the opera is going to be structured?
It is how the opera is structured. So the opera keeps that 3-part structure. Yeah. And as you say, so the first and third part tell a pretty conventionally structured narrative, which begins when the narrator, who's an American expat living and teaching high school in Sofia, the capital of Bulgaria, he goes to a cruising bathroom and pays a younger Bulgarian man named Mitko for sex. And that begins what will be about a 3-year sort of difficult relationship between them, that I think of as a love story, even if as a very sort of compromised love story. And then the second section, which is kind of interrupts that structure, and has a lot of meditations on the narrator's childhood and growing up in Kentucky and his relationship with his parents, and sort of this question of how did he become the sort of person we get to know in the first and third parts.
Yeah, there's lots of toxic masculinity all over this book too.
There is lots of toxic masculinity. And, the thing, so the book is not autobiography, but I, like the narrator, I spent 4 years in Sofia, Bulgaria. And, in one hand, like moving to Sofia when I was 31 or something, seemed like the sort of natural progression of what had basically been, at that point, a 16-year flight from Kentucky. Bulgaria seemed like the furthest I could possibly get from the place that I was born. And what shocked me, I had this absolutely vertiginous experience of finding that in this place that was so foreign in so many ways, I was sort of forced to confront my childhood. And there were aspects of life in Bulgaria in 2009, especially as a gay person, that really put me back in Kentucky of the early and mid 90s. And it was that experience, that sort of vertiginous experience of being in a place that was at once so foreign and then in another way so uncannily familiar. That's really the experience that this novel came out of. I feel like I had to write the novel in order to understand that experience.
And I know that so many of us gay men of our generation have had a mitku in our lives. And I don't know if you heard the podcast S-Town, the serial podcast.
Did, yeah.
There's Tyler from that. You meet these people, and why do we, I'm not saying you, but why do we fall in love with these men who are just so dangerous and, and treat us so badly?
Well, this is the thing that makes desire sort of the greatest plot point. Desire is the thing that disrupts all of our plans, all of our good intentions. And something that I love about desire is that as a narrative artist, is that on one hand, it sort of hypercharges agency. Like people, when they feel desire, will do the craziest things to get the object of their desire. And yet it is also an experience of just utter subjection to this force that is greater than we are, because none of us gets to choose what we desire. And that dynamic of sort of passivity and then agency is just endlessly fascinating to me. And I wanted, in writing the novel, and I think David's adaptation of this holds really true to this dynamic, I wanted to explore a situation where, there is an erotic and more than erotic, also an affective and emotional relationship again across all of these gulfs of difference, gulfs of language difference, gulfs of national difference, gulfs of age, gulfs of material privilege. And also this relationship is structured from its very beginning by transaction, the fact that money changes hands. And I wanted to explore a relationship that is sort of complicated and compromised in all of those ways, a relationship that never gets to leave that stuff behind or pretend it doesn't matter, but that also a relationship that is not exhausted by those things. I do think What Belongs to You is a love story, again, of a very compromised and difficult kind. But whenever you have a human interaction, a face-to-face interaction between two human beings, I think you have the potential for the whole gamut of human response, from, violence to the kind of desire and eros that, as Audre Lorde wrote, allows us to sort of stand face to face with the other and feel something other than fear, that sort of can cast bridges, maybe sort of uncertain and fallible bridges, but bridges, the possibility of contact across all of those gulfs of difference. And I wanted to write both of those things. I wanted to write the compromised nature of the relationship, and I also wanted to write these moments where there is a kind of human surplus between these two human beings and sort of points of connection that, as I say, I mean, I think the appropriate word for them is love.
Well, that was beautiful. And I almost don't want to mess it up by having a follow-up question on just that relationship and the narrator and Mitku, which to me feels very much my generation and relationships we might have with, with the closet and with self-hatred. And I wonder if this young generation, the Zs, they have so much more understanding of like the idea of oppression and like microaggressions, and they don't accept being demeaned, and I just, in working with people that age, I feel like, oh, you're never going to understand what we went through, and if this, I mean, I know that this book will have a long life, but if sort of the power imbalance here is something that they'll be able to relate to.
I don't think there is any social progress that is going to take power differentials out of Eros. I think we have this ideal now of sort of, there is a desire of sort of these perfectly matched equals. Well, I mean, that condition of sort of perfectly evenly matched power is almost non-existent in the actual world in which actual concrete human beings meet each other. And again, desire is the thing that destroys all of our best intentions. So I do not think we are ever going to be able to engineer a world in which sort of perfect people who have exactly the same measure of power sort of in this frictionless way have conflictless romantic or erotic relationships. Like, I just don't think that's ever going to be part of the human experience. And frankly, I worry very much about the way in which we have become so frightened of the problematic. This is a book that is about a relationship that is really significantly problematic. And, we have developed, maybe especially sort of in kind of progressive leaning sort of spheres, I think we have developed an attachment to a sense of our own moral purity that is utterly degrading of the project of being a human being. And something that, to me is endlessly inspiring about the history of queer spaces, the kinds of queer erotic communities that historically queer people and especially gay men have formed, and not just historically, continue to form, is that, the bathroom where my two characters meet is maybe the only place where two characters who are separated by so much can meet, and can meet in a way that allows them to have an intimate, emotional, erotic, face-to-face connection. And that's also what cruising spaces did for me when I was a kid. I grew up in a radically racist society. Everything in my world was constructed to keep me apart from other groups of people. And when I went to Cherokee Park in Louisville, Kentucky, which was the cruising park in the town, and I met men, all of those lines by which we organize our lives are scrambled in those spaces. And that means that, yes, those are scary spaces and potentially problematic spaces. They are also spaces of extraordinary human potential. And one of the things I wanted to do in my novel was to write those spaces as spaces of sort of full humanity, which means spaces in which people have all kinds of interactions, including interactions that I think are kind of infinitely valuable, and also in which human beings who are endowed with a kind of infinite dignity come together. And I, in that sense, feel quite protective and of the human possibility that can occur when we accept that life is problematic and that we don't get to have perfectly clean, untroubled social interactions, and that actually a world that was designed that way would be an unbearable and an antiseptic world. And that, in fact, all of us are always morally impure, morally compromised. And that's the situation in which we have to try to love each other. Like, that's what I'm interested in writing. I am not interested in purity. I am not interested, and desire is not interested in purity either. So there will never be a world in which the kinds of patterns that you're talking about as being sort of historically specific, I don't think they're historically specific. I think they are built into desire. I think they are built into the human. And I don't think we should reject that. I think we should try to embrace it.
Death in Venice, as directed by Ken Kazan at Chicago Opera Theater in, I forget, 19 something, was so shockingly erotic for me and so beautiful that I don't think I've ever been as moved as I was in being able to see gay desire on stage and a beautiful, beautiful dancer be assaulted. And it was horrible, but it was also, I felt so grateful that somebody thought to put this on the stage for me, you know? And I'm imagining what, you know, what's going to happen with the show with Kareem, who's such a beautiful artist, and Mark Morris, who is, like we said, so iconic and understands the male gaze. And this story that we have to work with, what your hopes are for the final product and what it might do for, you know, the audience.
I mean, that's a really big question and a really good question. And, you know, one of the things about how Mark Morris works is that, and I respect this very much, is that he is extremely protective of work in progress and extremely protective of performers who are rehearsing. And so, you know, rehearsals, as he has been working on the staging with Kareem and with the ensemble, those have all been closed. Like, even sort of I and David have not been invited to them. And there was one open rehearsal. The final rehearsal this past month was open, and it was just after I had left New York and was on the road to Iowa City. So when I go to Richmond in September to the Maudlin Center, I will be seeing the staging for the first time. And I am apprehensive about it, you know, because it is such a strange experience to see this world that you reimagined by someone else. But I also have just extraordinary faith in Mark Morris. I mean, I do think he's a genius. I think his work engages with all of these dynamics in ways that feel exciting and provocative and recognizable to me. So, I mean, I don't know what I hope, you know. I'm going with sort of as open a mind as I can have, and I'm excited to see whatever he adds to it, you know. I mean, I feel like David already has enriched this world I imagined by creating this extraordinary sort of sound universe. Kareem has enriched this voice, you know, that I followed for years as I was writing this. I wrote this book over 4 years. And now when I think back to those 4 years when I was, you know, trying to follow this voice sentence by sentence, it's Kareem's voice that I hear. That's an extraordinary enrichment. And now Mark Morris is going to bring sort of his theatrical genius to it. And I don't know what to expect. And in some way, I'm trying not to expect anything. But I suspect he's going to make something extraordinary.
After a little, I am taken in and put to bed. Sleep, soft, smiling, draws me unto her, and those receive me quietly treat.
Just to remind you all what Karim Suleiman sounds like, a chamber version of Knoxville, summer of 1915. That version made by Yuval Sharon, and that audio comes from Karim's Instagram.
Yeah, you got something to say? Then yeah, all right, you can say something. This is Listener Mailbag.
Hey, make sure you subscribe to our podcast for more Inside the Huddles. Spotify, click follow. Apple Podcasts, hit the plus sign. So Oliver's off to Santa Fe. He's been beaten there by Dale from Phoenix, who has already been to the festival. And in our listener mailbag, he writes this. Dale from Phoenix says, I'd like to pay special kudos to Santa Fe Opera for the world premiere of The Righteous by Gregory Spears and Tracy K. Smith. The piece is very topical and charts a wealthy oil family from an unnamed southwestern U.S. state with the oil baron himself as patriarch who becomes governor. The music is accessible that allows the voices to soar and to be heard, and the opera belongs to the first and second wives of the oil baron's son, who's an evangelical preacher. Dale goes on, Jennifer Cano didn't spare anything vocally or dramatically as the first wife. The voice was big, dramatic, had the necessary urgency. Second wife, Elena Violon's voice and character was more reserved. Her beautiful floated high notes and lyricism contrasted well with Cano's vocal writing and her approach. Stars in the cast include Greer Grimsley as the patriarch, Anthony Roth Costanzo as his gay son, and also a shout out to Nicholas Newton, who recently sang Alidoro at Lyric, who was the preacher of a black church whose hopes were dashed by the new governor. The chorus was spectacular, the set's simple and effective, and Dale says, my hope is that more companies pick up this fine work. He says, looking at you, Peter Gelb, just don't overproduce the piece. Well, you shouldn't ever accuse us of overproducing on this show. Certainly not in the 2 Minute Drill.
This just in, the 2 Minute Drill.
All right, listen up. Here's everything you need to know about what happened in Operaland this week.
The Teatro de la Zarzuela has broken records in sales and subscriptions for its upcoming season. The company has sold over 4,000 subscriptions and more than 40,000 tickets, with several performances already sold out.
Una semana gigante for Zarzuela. Tenor Juan Diego Flórez has announced the first Zarzuela album on his very own label, launching this autumn. J-Flo will be leaving his current partnerships with Sony and Decca in order to focus on this new imprint. Flórez Records, the best name for a label ever.
Absolutely obsessed with J-Flo. Apple Music Classical continues its conquest of the classical music ecosystem, announcing even more new partnerships with leading organizations in the industry. Aspen Music Festival, Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center, Hong Kong Philharmonic, and the Verbier Festival. Other Apple Music Classical partners include the Berlin Philharmonic, Carnegie Hall, Chicago Symphony Orchestra, the Royal Concertgebouw Orchestra, the Metropolitan Opera, New York Philharmonic, Opera Nationale de Paris, Cleveland Orchestra, San Francisco Symphony, and the Vienna Philharmonic.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer announced the American Federation of Musicians and Employers Pension Plan, which will ensure that 50,000 musicians will receive a $1.5 billion pension fix. The union's pension plan was expected to be insolvent by 2034. Quote, this will ensure that musicians and their families receive the hard-earned benefits that they paid into their whole lives. Said Schumer, this money was lost through no fault of their own.
Yes. for sure the most consequential thing that Chuck Schumer did in July of 2024. The first ever Sumi Jo International Singing Competition has crowned its inaugural winners. 22-year-old Chinese baritone Zihao Li won first place with a prize of 50,000 euros. Second place with a 20,000 euro award went to Romanian tenor George Virban, and third place with 10,000 euros was awarded to South Korean tenor Kyup Lee.
In trade news, Fort Worth Opera has announced that Kurt Howard will return to the organization now as production manager and stage manager. He previously worked with the company in that same dual position for a decade, starting in the aughts, before moving on to be producing director at Opera Omaha.
Exit stage right, English mezzo-soprano Margaret Cable has died at age 82. Cable was a specialist in historically informed Baroque performance and appeared in a number of notable recordings, including Messiah, conducted by Andrew Parrott. She was also a fellow at the Royal College of Music, where she was head of vocal studies.
English soprano April Cantello has died at age 96. Cantello was closely associated with modern works by composers including Hans Werner Henze, Kurt Weill, Malcolm Williamson, and Benjamin Britten. She also frequently performed Baroque music, made several notable recordings, and was married to conductor Sir Colin Davis.
And on this day, July 22nd in 1817, is the birth of Latvian soprano Paulina Rivoli, who created two roles in operas by Moniuszko, Halka, and the Countess, two title roles. 1826 was the birth of French baritone Julia Stockhausen, no relation to Karl Heinz. In 1845, French bass Léon Gresse was born. He created the role of Fanuel in Massenet's Hérodiade. More French people. 1848, baritone French Lucien Fougère was born in Paris. He created roles in more than 30 operas. Coming back to the real world, America. 1913, Licia Albanese was born. She was born in Italy, but we call her American. In 1928, German contralto Ursula Böse was born in Hamburg. She created the role of Miss Penelope in the most important opera of all, Help, Help, the Globulinks. That's by Menotti. And in 1936, English mezzo-soprano Anne Howard was born in London. First performances include André Campra and Henri Desmarais' Amphigénie en Tauride in Paris in 1704. In 1727, it was the first performance of Giovanni Bononcini's Assianate in London. In 1751, Nicola Jomelli's Lucellatrice premiered in Venice. Johann Christian Friedrich Hefner's Elektra premiered in Stockholm this day in 1787. Etienne Nicolas Méhul's Melidor et Rosine premiered in Paris in 1794. Also in Paris, 1797 saw the first performance of André Gretry's The Barber of the Village or The Revenant. In 1833, more Parisian opera Ali Baba by Luigi Cherubini in 1833. And in 1839, Ambroise Thomas's Le Panier Fleuri premiered in Paris. Where else? Now, getting out of Paris, in 1847, Giuseppe Verdi's I Masnadieri premiered in London starring Jenny Lind. And on this day, in 1868, one of the most important operas of all, Die Hochzeit auf der Alm, premiered in Salzburg. That's by Michael Haydn. Of course you knew that. On July 22nd.
And that's your 2-minute drill.
A little bit of the finale of the inaugural Sumi Jo competition. And you have to watch the Instagram video. I don't know if we can link it to our website, but here are these, 20-something singers, and Sumi Jo is trying to crowd them with her gigantic dress.
I don't think she owns any other clothing, Oliver. Like, what do you want her to wear?
She's always so extra.
She exclusively wears ball gowns.
And apparently she doesn't drink because they're all trying to, Brindisi it up, and she's not holding anything in her hand, so it's okay.
She Brindisisn't.
Yikes.
There you
It's
go.
bad for her consumption.
Weston, you're all over the Apple Music. You have more stuff to listen to now.
Well, apparently I do. I mean, we've talked about this before. Apple Classical is making huge, massive plays. And, I think it still baffles me, their strategy and like, because obviously there is money to be made. I believe that someone at Apple believes that to be the case. It just makes me nervous when one company is getting all these contracts together, building exclusive deals, and legitimately it is exciting to be able to get to hear music from festivals that might be harder to track down in sort of official recordings. But, I yearn for the days when, Decca and Deutsche Grammophon were two separate companies and competing with each other, instead of relying on a massive monopoly. And it really, really makes me nervous when...
What if there's a CrowdStrike glitch?
Exactly. That is actually a similar kind of concern. There's the glitches. There's the, specific, contracts. There are still some favorite opera recordings of mine that are not available on Apple Classical because of some, contractual glitch or another. A lot of them seem to have to do with the Carry On estate. I'm missing my Carry On Tristan and Isolde that I like so much. It's one of those things where, it's a very 21st century problem. You have a lot of this access and it's very exciting. And then, at a certain point, someone decides it's no longer profitable and the entire thing collapses.
I mean, Weston and I have firsthand knowledge of arts organizations trying to figure out where to invest, and they are leaving radio, and apparently they're going to streaming services.
Yeah.
So it's, what's going to happen when Apple decides, like Weston suggests, like, maybe we're not interested in this anymore,
Right. And once again, classical music's like, a good 15, 20 years behind the times. And we've already seen the collapse of the streaming. We are seeing in real time the collapse of the streaming model for film and TV. So the writing on the wall is not very positive there.
Yeah.
Keep radio alive, people. Donate to your local PBS.
Donate to your favorite opera podcast, everybody.
There you go.
Well, they're cutting new cloth at Fort Worth. So Kurt Howard, he's a friend of mine. He's not a friend of the show because he hasn't been on it, but he has been in this bit. He has produced or stage managed more operas than I've had hot dinners, probably. He did a decade at Fort Worth Opera starting in 2004 and then a decade at Opera Omaha. So he's going back to Fort Worth, and this production manager, stage manager combo platter is, for those of you who don't know, the stage manager is like in the rehearsal room, making sure the staging is written down, communicating with all the design departments. The production manager is outside of the rehearsal room, figuring out how to price everything out, how to source everything that's needed for the physical, scenic, costumes, lighting, schedule for the production.
It's hard to do both.
I think it's going to allow them to produce in a much more economical and essential way.
Just some breaking news. We are recording on July 22nd, and today the Metropolitan Opera confirmed that they are producing 2 new works based on novels. How timely.
There we go.
Well,
Missy Mazzoli will write the music for George Saunders's Lincoln and the Bardo with the libretto by Royce Vavrek, slated to premiere in LA in early 2026 and arriving at the Met in the fall of that year. And as we already know, Mason Bates is already writing Michael Chabon's Amazing Ventures of Cavalier and Clay with libretto by Gene Shearer. That opera gets its premiere at Indiana University before coming to the Met.
When will they bring Wuthering Heights by Bernard Herrmann back to the stage? That's what I'm saying.
I'm going to say it's unlikely.
Getting that breaking news in just before we wrap this show up.
Good call. Bad call on Opera Box Score.
Good call, bad call. To finish things up for the week, we're going to start, as always, with Oliver Camacho.
Early warning that Benjamin Bernheim, friend of the show, and Carrie Ann Matheson, friend of the show, are releasing an album on the DG label called Douce France, which I assume are French songs with piano, because Carrie Ann Matheson is not an orchestra.
Not with that attitude, she's not.
Matt Cummings.
Last week, I had an absolute blast going to see the very, very stupid movie Twisters. That is so fun and does include scenes where someone looks up a land developer and comes across a website that says, "We buy land," with exclamation points, and that's when she finds out that he's actually a bad guy. So real Meyerbeerian levels of telegraphing and natural disaster. let's make it an opera. And the movie grossed almost as much money as Kamala Harris.
That's it for this week's edition of America's Talk Radio Show about opera. Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. Get your voice heard and find links to stuff we've talked about at our website, operaboxscore.com. And that's also where you can put your money where our mouths are. Give back to the OBS using the Support the Team tab. Your announcer is Norm Waddell, your creative consultant is Oliver Camacho, and your audio editor is Weston Williams. For co-host Matt Cummings, with guest Garth Greenwell, I'm George Cedarquist, asking you to continue the conversation about opera as you conquer the classical music ecosystem. We're back with an all-new show next week when we get into the Olympic spirit Sforzando style. Plus you get more opera headlines, more hot takes, and more Zarzuela. Ay, 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 ay! Join us.